What's up, everybody? The Game 2K2 here once again, and today I'm here to revise my top 10 worst video games list from 1995 to 2011. For those who listen to my commentary on this video know that, like many others, I myself was not particularly satisfied with my original video. Time constraints kept me from focusing on the list as much as I should have. I was originally going to create a list on my entire game collection that I had, but because time was so short, the original list was only created out of 30 games. Don't get me wrong, I still consider the original games I put on that list to be bad as well, but most of them should not have been on that list, and that's why I'm back to do it again. Now, before I begin, let me just give the usual warning. If you don't agree with some of my choices, please do not get angry, but I would love to see what your top 10 list would be. Okay, let's not waste any more time. Let's begin. Now, some numbers are going to be left out because 3 games from my original video still made it onto this list. Tony Hawk Ride remains on this list, but this time it's at number 10. 3 Extreme remains on the list at number 5. And somehow, Superman for the N64 made it onto the list, but it's been moved down to number 2. That's right, I found a game that is worse than Superman for the N64. Okay, let's get started with the rest of the list. Number 9. McGrath vs. Pastrana Motocross. First of all, good motocross games are very hard to come by. Some succeed, but most fail. But none have failed harder than this. Most motocross games have similar issues, good graphics, but bad gameplay. This game actually had a great deal of potential, featuring 2 very popular motocross racers, so it seemed like the budget might actually be very good for this game. But everything looks extremely cheap, including the graphics. To make matters worse, this game's controls are unresponsive and very poorly set up. In the end, you'll wind up button mashing like crazy, doing tricks and having no damn clue how the hell you're doing them. And there's nothing like playing a game where the frame rate is so choppy that you almost feel like you can't play the game at all. So overall, just another bad game by Acclaim. It was so sad seeing a company as legendary as Acclaim go down the gutter the way they did. Number 8. Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker. I know many people are going to argue that this was bad because it was a movie adaptation, but considering that 2 good Batman games before this were based on the movies, and the game based on the animated series Batman and Robin being very good as well, made many of us believe that this wouldn't be half bad. The game seemed fairly simple. It was just a beat-em-up game. Just keep moving forward and kick the crap out of anyone in front of you. However, bad attack setups and the fact that Batman's gadgets are pretty much useless makes this gameplay very dead and uneventful. The horrible attack setup makes everything very slow. Graphically, it looks like something that would come out for the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. I wouldn't mind that so much, except this was the N64 and the PlayStation, 2 easily superior consoles when compared to the Genesis and SNES. And yet, none of those graphical capabilities are used here. This was just another miserable failure by Kemco. It doesn't take a genius to figure out why Kemco is no longer around. Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker is just one of many reasons why Kemco was doomed from the very beginning. Number 7. WCW Backstage Assault. In the late 90s and early 2000s, it seemed as though wrestling games were reaching their peak in both quality and popularity. However, with Backstage Assault, it seemed as though EA and Kodiak Interactive were just banking that the popularity of wrestling would help sell this miserable excuse for a game. I like the idea that a wrestling game is nothing but backstage brawls because that was very popular at the time, but limited amount of wrestling modes, horrible looking wrestlers, horrible textures, and an extreme lack of actual wrestling moves makes this game look like nothing more than a half-baked game. It looks even worse when you're comparing it to the early SmackDown games, which were awesome in both visuals and wrestling. Overall, with WCW Backstage Assault, I like the idea, and I think Kodiak had an interesting concept, but they just didn't pull it off. Enough said. Number 6. Dead Space Ignition. When it comes to good ideas, none seemed cooler than Dead Space Ignition. First of all, I love both the Dead Space games. I found them to be well designed, the gameplay was intense and had some legitimately frightening moments, and we all know that a game that has nothing but boring and completely uninteresting minigames is just going to fit right in, right? Wait a minute. No, that doesn't fit right in. In fact, that sounds rather stupid. The cool idea actually came from the game's comic book design, and actually rather good voice acting. However, the whole point of the game was to do nothing but reach the end so you could unlock features to Dead Space 2. So it winds up feeling more like a job than an actual game. And I know that a lot of people are going to say that this game shouldn't count because it's a downloadable game, but I've seen some great downloadable games released in the last few years, so I view them as equals to the retail-released games. So overall, Dead Space Ignition's cool concept is nothing but a boring mess and has no reason to even exist. Number 4. World Series of Poker. Only one word describes this game: boring. As if the show wasn't boring enough, this game is even worse. To me, there's only two ways to play poker: at a casino or at a table with your friends. You know, the game that includes real cards and not a game controller. I'm convinced that Left Field Productions can no longer create anything good. After leaving Nintendo, they started producing games like this. Believe it or not, this is the same company that released Excite Bike 64, which is arguably the best motocross game in video game history. Now they're releasing World Series of Poker. Here's some good advice, Left Field. Go back to Nintendo! Number 3. MTV Sports Skateboarding. This was pretty much THQ's retaliation to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and believe it or not, this game released only 8 days before Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. Thankfully, no one picked this one up because the only quality that this shares with the Tony Hawk franchise is the fact that it includes skateboarding. The graphics stink, the controls are horrendous on both the PC and PS1. It's really sad, too, because I did have high hopes for this to be a great rival to the Tony Hawk's franchise, because just 1 year before this, the MTV Sports video game franchise came out with MTV Sports Snowboarding, which was actually a really good game. However, none of the good qualities of that game make it to skateboarding, and it looks even worse when comparing it to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. And what game could possibly beat Superman for the N64? Rogue Warrior. Not only is this game bad, but this has already gone down as one of the biggest, if not the biggest, disappointments in video game history. So much advertising, so much hype brought on by the well-respected developer Bethesda Software, and we get a game that is easily the worst game from the last 16 years of gaming. And the fact that this is worse than Superman for the N64 says a great deal. This game is boring, extremely short, and has an extremely unpolished look to it. This game is literally glitch hell. It's so bad that it's quite frankly unplayable. I bought this game at a local gaming store where I live for a grand total of $1.50, and the game's not even 3 years old yet. I guess I shouldn't have expected much since it was developed by Rebellion, because they can't seem to ever develop anything good. But it was produced by Bethesda Software, who brought us the awesome Elder Scrolls series, so I assumed that this would be equally as good. But we wound up getting one of the worst games in history, and I feel that even $1.50 is way too much to spend on this game. Well, that's my revised top 10 worst video games from 1995 to 2011, and again, I really do apologize for how the original video turned out. I wish I could have spent as much time as I originally wanted on that video, but unfortunately it turned out the way it did, and again, I do apologize. But I do hope that this revised video does make up for it. Well, everyone, that's it for now. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.